Our castaway this week is a singer who covers a very wide range of songs. It's Cathy Berberian. Miss Berberian, where do we start? Let's have the first disc. What have you chosen?
Well, the first recording is of folk songs, Bulgarian folk songs, basically because I adore folk songs, and they were practically the first things that I heard when I was a little girl. They were Armenian and Russian, actually, but I have since become a great fan of the Bulgarian folk songs. Mm-hmm. Also because my father was born in Bulgaria, even though he came from an Armenian family. And somehow, even though it's an environmental background, it has an enormous influence on me.
And what about the song?
It's three voices, female voices, working in seconds and beautiful dissonances, and some of the widest use of the voice that I know. I think it's one of the most exciting pieces of folk music.
Is it not?
The drums roll by the chorus of the ensemble of the Bulgarian Republic. Right, so you were born of Armenian parents in America, of course.
Yes, in Massachusetts.
Did you hear a lot of music as a child? Were your parents musical?
My mother is very musical. My father could take it or leave it and generally left it. But my mother had a lot of records around, and she was wise enough to permit me to use the records. Even as a little girl, she figured that all right, if a record broke, it was okay, but the important thing was that I should want to play a record and hear music.
What sort of records were they mainly?
They were opera. Most of them were opera.
Yes.
The first record was sort of like the blinding revelation that Saul had in the Bible.
Was singing then your first ambition, your first interest?
Well, it was my first interest in classical music came from listening to this record of Tito Schipa singing Ecco ridente in cielo from Barber of Seville.
Yes.
And I literally flipped my lid.
So you wanted to sing?
I wanted to sing.
Where did you study?
Well, I studied with the records, believe it or not. I used to sing along with Lily Pons and sing along with Ezio Pinza and old recordings of Shalyapin. So I was doing the baritone repertoire, the bass repertoire, and the coloratura repertoire. Nobody had told me that you can't, you see, so I did.
And learning piano as well?
Yes, rather reluctantly, but I learned it.
And then when you went to music college?
No, you see, what happened was that I had a very small voice, a very thin voice. As a matter of fact, my family called it a frog's voice. And everyone would laugh at the idea of my wanting to be a singer. And, for them, the big voices, the more Sarakavaye type of voices were the ones that really counted. But I was very stubborn, and I knew that I had to sing, and I just continued, So what I did was when I finished high school, I took a part-time job to pay for my lessons. I wouldn't have to ask my father and go through that whole hassle, What do you want to sing for?
Mm. Now, you did, in fact, go to study in Italy.
Yes, I had all the icing. I had all of the interpretation and the repertoire and everything, but the voice wasn't in line. And I went to Italy to find the voice, and I found a teacher who could put it in line, and I also found a husband who was a young music student in the conservatory at the time and who later became the very great Luciano Berio.
Well, let's break at this point your arrival on the Italian scene for your second record.
Record always been very important to me as a young girl in America. After discovering Tito Schipa, I used to spend all of my pocket money for piano scores, piano voice scores, and I would listen to the Saturday afternoon performances of the Metropolitan. And the way I was learning the repertoire. And in the beginning, I thought I was a coloratura, so I learned all of the high parts, the Manon, the Lucia, and Gilda, and all that. And then I was told by Herbert Graf that I was a mezzo, so I started learning Carmen. And
you'd already been through the bass and baritone roles.
Oh yes, well that was continuous. Right. You should hear me on a late night when I do my version of Shalyapin singing the flea. But opera has been a consistent love with me. And perhaps the opera that I have loved most, the whole opera, is La Bohème. And I would like to hear the Lucia Albanese recording of it, because that's the one that became very important to me when I was a young girl, because I heard the live performance of this recording.
Lucia Albanese as Mimi in La Boheme. So, an American, Armenian, Bulgarian opera student in Italy. What happened next? You got a Fulbright to help you study, a scholarship.
Yes. In order to get a Fulbright, I needed an accompanist, and someone found him for me, and that was Luciano Berio.
The man you married.
That's the man I married, and the day that we married was the day that my Fulbright began, and so we had our first year of married life very comfortably subsidized by the United States government.
Splendid. And did you sing the Italian repertory in Italy?
Well, we began that way because in order to earn some money, Luciano was conducting, and he conducted Lucia and Rigoletto, and I sang Alisa, the handmaiden of Lucia, and did Magdalena in Rigoletto. But I didn't find that the opera world was for me. I have too many things going on in my head to be able to settle down into that routine.
Now, Luciano Berio discovered that his musical ideas were really rather different from those of Puccini or Verdi.
I would say they were a continuation, but in another line. Actually, when we had gotten married, he brought up this new field that he was interested in, because as a singer I was very square, strictly classical, and he talked about Wozzeck of Alban Berg. And when I first heard that, I thought, oh my God, if he writes music like this, we're going to starve. And little by little I began to understand it, to appreciate it, and finally to love it. And then it was just one more step for me to do that kind of music, the kind that he was writing.
How would you describe what he was writing? He was really enlarging the frontiers of music.
Yes, well, it's very difficult because lots of labels have been given to the kind of music, the new music that was being written in the 50s. It was called post-Webern and post, I don't know what else. And serialistic, they called it. But the real composers couldn't be fitted under a title. They used avant-garde, but it's become such a cliche that avant-garde doesn't work anymore. I just consider it good, new music.
Now, you spent a number of years performing this music. Did you find it was rather limiting to your sort of this kind of music?
Well, actually, in a way, it expanded many aspects of my career that I hadn't anticipated. And it literally made a name for me, but it became rather harrying to think that I was only considered as a contemporary music singer when I had a whole complete background of other things behind me. But I owe a great deal to contemporary music because, in a way, it made it possible for me to meet one of the greatest musicians of all times, Igor Stravinsky.
With whom you worked?
With whom I worked.
Yes.
We did several concerts and recordings together. But the relationship, the friendship relationship, was one of the high moments of my life.
So that's why you've chosen a record by Stravinsky that's on your list here.
Also because it happens to be one of the masterpieces of all time, and that's the Sacre de Printemps, the Rites of Spring. And I've chosen, I think, one of the most exciting moments of that.
sacrifice from Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, Pierre Monteux conducting the Paris Conservatoire Orchestra. What other composers have you worked with, have written for you?
Well, there have been lots of composers that have written for me. There was Darius Milhaud and Bussotti and Pousseur. It was getting to be a little bit stuffy, though, because it got so that no one wanted to think of me. There was this cliché of contemporary music. To the point, I'll tell you, I was at an avant-garde festival in Sweden, and I found out that they were performing the film of Rosenkavalier with Herbert von Karajan conducting. And I wanted very badly to see it, and I asked an avant-garde sculptor to take me there, and he was fairly unwilling, but he said he would. And we went there, and of course, unfailingly, during the trio, I started to cry, and he was so shocked.
That last act trio.
That drove him, I don't know, I think my reputation was completely shattered, because he couldn't reconcile the fact that I was an avant-garde performer. I should have been totally committed to avant-garde, and all of the rest of music ought to be trash.
And that is another of your Desert Island discs, the trio
yes,
from
I
Der
couldn't live with it.
Rosenkavalier.
And it has to have Elisabeth Schwarzkopf in it. I don't care who else is singing, but Schwarzkopf's Marschallin is unbeatable.
The trio from the last act of Der Rosenkavalier, Christa Ludwig, Dick Randall, and Elisabeth Schwarzkopf. There's an intriguing note here that you did some experimental work with Peter Brook. What was that about?
Well, he invited me and about 5 or 6 other people of different crafts, I should say, to exchange ideas and experiences with his nuclear group. I would be teaching them the use of voice in other ways besides acting. And there was an actress, and there was a director, Chaikin, from the Open Theatre. And we spent 3 weeks exchanging information, performance information, and trying and dancing and singing. And it was one of the most important moments of my career, too.
Bouncing off each other.
Bouncing off each other. The things I learned. As a matter of fact, when I first went into the group, I felt like it was Mars. And at the end of 3 weeks, I thought going back to Earth was Mars. It was totally mind-boggling.
You have this extraordinary gift for languages. How many do you sing in?
Well, for the moment, 26. But
26.
I'll take on any language as long as I can hear it performed authentically.
How many of those do you speak?
3 3/4. French, English, and Italian I speak fluently. Armenian, half and half, and 1/4 German, just enough to order a good meal and find my way to the railroad station.
Let's have another record. We've got to number 5.
Well, this, in a way, represents my insane desire to get out of the avant-garde cliché. Honencourt asked me to perform in his recording of Orfeo of Monteverdi, and I had never done Monteverdi before. And I hedged a while because I felt that we might conflict on performance style. Anyway, he liked what I did, and we recorded it, and from then on I became, again, a kind of Monteverdi expert. That's what they called it. And this performance is of the Della Consort doing Lamento della Ninfa of Claudio Monteverdi, the part that's called Amor, one of the most beautiful Baroque torch songs.
Amor
the Della Consort, Monteverdi's Amor from Lamento la Ninfa from Madrigali Amorosi.
Good.
Now, you've rethought and given new life to the old recital. And to start with, you give your recitals titles. Let me quote one or two. Second-hand songs, songs by women composers, from the sublime to the ridiculous, and so on.
Yes.
This opens up possibilities.
Well, I feel that there's such a possibility of making a recital evening far from that stodgy chiffon handkerchief in one's hand school singing.
Yes.
And I started out with my Monteverdi to the Beatles, making
Yes.
it a kind of panorama of different vocal styles. And then I went into Sublime the Ridiculous, which was a funny recital in costume. And second-hand songs grew out of that, which are derivative things which were originally for, let's say, symphony or for piano, that some crazy people had put words to and delivered them into utterly insane areas. And then I did Folklore and the Composer, which includes all of those 26 languages we were talking about.
Folk songs of all sorts of folk.
But generally in relationship to the composer.
And you do some rather malicious impressions of out-of-tune singers. It's very difficult to sing out of tune, isn't it? Unless you do it naturally, I mean.
Yes, that's true. I think it's probably the most difficult part of my clowning, to sing bad. I cannot listen to my recordings of singing off-key. I love to perform that way, but I cannot listen to them.
And you talked about your Baroque versions of Beatles songs. Of course, you do some teaching and
Oh, yes, I do a lot of master classes. I find that most singing teachers have their hands full just getting the voice in line. They don't usually have enough time to develop the contours that every singer should have that goes beyond just the singing. How many times I've been asked by the pupils, what do I do with my hands? And it's so strange because I don't have any problem, so I have to start from way back and figure out what would I do if I had trouble with my hands.
a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other.
Right. But I find that many people have been vocally prepared, let's say, for opera,
Yes.
but they don't understand what it is to be a global performer, for example, the way Callas was. She was so totally perfect in her performances. The character was absolutely right, and the gestures and the inner light which illuminated her was as if she herself was the character. And that happened so very rarely. Of course, there'll never be another Callas. And that's one of the reasons why I felt that I couldn't go on that desert island without her.
Maria Callas in the second act of Puccini's Tosca. Of course, recording plays a very big part in your career, doesn't it?
Yes. I would say that it's the filo conduttore, as we say in Italian. It's the thread that goes all the way through the little pearls of my existence. First of all, because it was a recording that turned me on to classical music. And I studied with them, literally, without knowing that I was studying, because I sang along with them. And then I sold records at G. Shermer's music store in
Did
America.
you?
Yes.
Successfully?
Of course.
You good at it?
Of course. Do I do anything not well? No, because I loved it. I loved helping people to find the records that they were looking for, you know. And then, of course, making records is very important, although I prefer live performances. And in making records, in a way, I'm not a perfectionist in the sense that I refuse to do a piece 30 and 40 times. I do it 2.5 times the maximum because I lose that
Spontaneity.
That spontaneity. There are other people who are just the reverse. You know, they have to build up to it, and it takes them the time. I'm just the opposite.
Another of your activities, you've translated a number of books from Italian.
Yes. Well, most of them are comic books. Comics in the sense of humorous books. Jules Pfeiffer cartoons, and I translated the 2 Woody Allens, because you have to be an American to understand the humor of the Woody Allen, and you have to know the analogous idea, the Italian idea. And then, of course, someone who was really Italian cleaned it up and adapted it for the pure Italian language.
We got to record number 7. What's that?
That's a very important part of my life. Luciano Berio. I mean, having to choose one record out of all the magnificent things he's done was probably the most difficult decision I had to make. And I think I picked one of the richest of his compositions. It's got everything in it. And the section that I chose is the very famous one, the 3rd movement, which incorporates the Mahler Resurrection Symphony theme. And it has, about 30 or 40 musical quotations popping up. And one can hear the Ravel Waltz and the Rosenkavalier waltzes wedded together in the most ingenious way.
You wait for the compulsory show to begin. It takes time. You hear a voice, perhaps it's a recitation. That is the show. Someone reciting selected passages, all the favorites, or someone improvising. You can barely hear it. That's the show. You can't leave. You're afraid to leave. You make the best of it. You try and be reasonable. You can't. It's only beginning. It hasn't begun. You'll appear any moment. You begin anyway. That's the show, waiting for the show to the sound of a murmur. Perhaps it's not the voice of God, perhaps it's the air ascending, descending, flowing, eddying, seeking exit, finding none when the spectators
Part of the 3rd movement of Luciano Berio's Sinfonia, the Swingle Singers with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by the composer. I suppose you're as likely a castaway for a desert island as anyone. How well do you think you could stand up to being a castaway?
Practically rather badly, because I'm a very sophisticated city dweller type. I think one of the first things I would do is to find out how many living people are on that island. I don't care if they're tribes or even cannibals.
We assume there's nobody on the island except you.
Oh, how disastrous. I was counting on playing the white goddess. Oh, that really smashes all of my plans.
I'm sorry, Cathy. We have rules, you see.
I see. Well, I'm just going to have to live rather primitively, I'm afraid.
Are you a good cook?
That's about the only thing I can do very well, yes.
What about escaping? Any ideas on that?
Well, that goes back to the practicality bit. I might have ideas, but I don't think any of them would work.
You don't fancy yourself doing a little woodwork and knocking together a ship?
Well, I could probably knock it together, but it would probably fall apart, knowing my proficiency.
You stayed just where you are.
Yeah.
Record number 8.
Well, record number 8 is a very important part of my life, too. It's the Beatles. Because partly it's involved with my daughter. She was in her teens when the Beatles came out, and I lived through that period with a great amount of joy. And I consider them to be an important aspect of contemporary music, and perhaps the best of them all.
And what are we going to hear?
Well, we're going to hear Eleanor Rigby, which is something that pulls at my heartstrings.
look at all the lovely people. Look at all the lovely people. Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. Lives in a dream, waits at the window, wearing the face that she keeps in a jar by the door.
Eleanor Rigby from the long player called Revolver by You Know Who. Now, out of these 8 records you've played to us today, which one would you take if you could only take one?
I think I would take Luciano Sinfonia, most representative of what I am.
And you're allowed to take one luxury to the island with you, nothing of any practical use.
Well, it depends on what you call practical. I consider it a luxury if you're on a desert island and as wild a combination of gourmet and gourmand that I am, I would have to have a box of spices with me. How can you eat those
yes,
herbs
we'll
and
allow
stuff
that.
without any coriander or tarragon? It's not possible.
A great big box of spices.
Oh, endless box.
Right. And one book, the Bible and Shakespeare, already placed on the island for you, and we put the bar up on big encyclopedias.
Well, I figured that some kooky friend of mine would have the insight to give me on leaving on the boat. It is a boat we're taking.
A boat,
yes.
I should think, yes. Sailing ship, if you
Yes,
like.
a sailing ship. Well, he would put into a basket of fruit either How to Survive on a Desert Island or Robinson Crusoe, if that were not available.
A good practical...
A good practical book to help me survive.
Right. We'll sort out the best one for you. In fact, we might even give you a selection. And thank you, Cathy Berberian, for letting us hear your Desert Island disc.
I'm sinking into the water.
Goodbye, everyone.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Desert Island Discs archive. For more podcasts, please visit bbc.co.uk/Radio4.